Okay, welcome everyone to our final Warren lecture of the academic year. Thank you everyone for joining both in person and online. It's my pleasure today to introduce our speaker, Professor Srinivas Peeta. Professor Peeta is the Frederick R. Dickerson Chair and Professor in the School of Civil Environmental Engineering at Georgia Tech, where he also holds an appointment in Industrial Systems Engineering, in the School of Industrial Systems Engineering. Professor Peeta has a very long biography, which I'm going to skip because he read the instructions very carefully and prepared a little slide on his career background, or his background and sort of his career path, which I think will be very informative. I will add that before joining Georgia Tech, Professor Peeta spent time at Purdue University, a long time at Purdue University, where I understand he got to meet some of our colleagues here. The one final thing I'll add is I found out last night that Professor Peeta's first academic talk was actually here in the city of Minneapolis at a conference a couple of years ago. And I think he's updated the slides a little bit since then. We'll find out. But please join me in welcoming Professor Peeta.
Hey. Thank you, Raphael. And first I wanted to thank the department for having me over for the Warren lecture. So I really appreciate the opportunity to talk. And I also want to thank my colleagues. They have been I had a chance to catch up with them. For those of you who watch or have watched Star Trek, you see Star Trek and you see Star Trek Next Generation. So the last time I came here, I saw Star Trek. This time I see the next generation of my colleagues in the transportation group. So it's nice to see. Of course, there's always a constant, always have one. Gary Davis is there. But I just wanted to, again, recollect some of the great moments I had during my last visit. But today I wanted to start out with a talk. I've been requested to have a talk which was broad enough. So it's more on a high level of what the problem is in the real world and where some of the challenges exist. And that's the objective of today's presentation. So just as a brief background in terms of career path, I started my career at Purdue University in 1994. Some of you may know, Mickey also started around the same time, so we were colleagues out there. Before that, I did my master's at Caltech, my PhD at University of Texas, Austin. And then Mickey was just telling me that the two of us had received the NSF Career Award in 1997 out there. So, and then some of the other things, just in terms of where the career paths have moved, we had a Region 5 UTC, the University Transportation Center. And I think before that, Minnesota had it. I'm sorry, so we kind of took it over from Minnesota. And so I directed that center till I left Purdue in 2018. And then around the 2016 or so, the next competition, there were multiple competitions in between, but there's one in 2016. And the next US DOT Region 5 center, which is called the Center for Connected and Automated Transportation, led by the University of Michigan. So I was the associate director of that. I also reflected that I had worked on problems with, in addition to colleagues in transportation, also problems with structural engineering colleagues, architectural engineering colleagues, and also materials colleagues in different areas, actually. So, and that kind of illustrated, as well, that transportation is inherently a multidisciplinary field, and that's a theme I wanted to emphasize. I have and I still volunteer for multiple journal editorial boards or associate editorships. And one of the things related to Transportation Research Board is as the chair of the Committee on Transportation Network Modeling for 6 years. And then at Georgia Tech, already, Raphael had mentioned this. I also have a designation as principal research faculty at Georgia Tech Research Institute. And I wanted to focus a little on the students and postdocs. I'm very proud of the mentorship award from the College of Engineering. It's a very competitive award that I received in 2012. And this is based on nominations from students, my past students, and my junior colleagues there. So, and then multiple student dissertation awards, paper awards, and presentation awards for my students. And several of them are in, the ones who have done their doctoral studies are in civil engineering, psychology, management, information science, and so on in academia around the world. And there are quite a few in the industry as well. They do consulting in transportation-related firms and other firms as well, tech companies, and airlines, retail. There's one even in autonomous vehicle startup, and then some work in national labs, or have worked in national labs, and others also have started their companies as well, or firms. And just around 2015 or so, Purdue normally celebrates its professors after a period of time. So there is a long 1-hour presentation if people are interested in details of some of the research side of what I did. It's called Networks All Around. It's on YouTube. And then currently we have a lab called the ACT Lab, the Autonomous and Connected Transportation Lab. And just last couple of points there. Transportation, again, wanted to emphasize the multidisciplinary field. But partly, I also envy students who are just starting out or are in the transportation domain over the last few years, because they'll see an increased advancement in terms of how technology is going to be used in multiple dimensions. And this is something that would, in my view, provide for a very exciting set of careers. And not just for folks from just what I call the traditional transportation group. I see this as something that is much broader in civil engineering and outside of civil engineering as well. And just as a thought for students, I'm typically like problems which originate from the real world, because when you start from the real world, the challenges that you face are substantial. And then I'd like to look at formal methods that one can use to come up with solutions for that. And broadly speaking, my research looks at problems holistically. So a systems perspective is a recurrent theme in some of the research that I have conducted in the past. So with that, I wanted to start on the problem that I'll be discussing today. So when we talk about communities, there is a lot of talk these days about communities getting smart and connected. And in that context, there are two dimensions that stand out. The first is that we have advanced technologies related to information, communication, and sensors that are organically showing up in communities. And some of these technologies have existed for a period of time. There are others that are advancing over time as well. And there is a social dimension to it, and that is these communities have a lot of disparities in terms of characteristics. So there is socio-demographic characteristics that are heterogeneous, and also the various stakeholder groups, because those are the ones that come together to look at solutions and then implement those solutions as well. So when we look at the social dimension, we talk about communities in terms of stakeholder levels, but even in terms of heterogeneities within stakeholder groups. And so if you bring the two of these together, then there is the potential to get data which is both qualitative and quantitative. And then the opportunity that exists then is, if we can do that, we could potentially get to information on which we can act, as well as come up with solution mechanisms that are targeted in an intelligent manner at different aspects or different areas of the community. And in this context, in this study context, we are looking at sustainable travel as the goal for that. And so I'll talk about what sustainable travel means. Sustainability is a very broad term and has to be defined in the context of the problem being addressed. So in this context, the other thing that's been happening, and this is something that if you're a community or city manager or city engineer, there are these other things that you'll notice, and that is the emergence of both new modes and new technologies. So you look at autonomy, connectivity, electrification, and you also have all these micromobility modes, and then transportation network companies such as Uber and Lyft, all of which are showing up. So you're seeing this, these are coming up organically. There's no clear organization or connectivity potentially, even with the governance of a community. And so with all of these showing up, the challenges then are, how do we come up with system level perspectives to come up with solutions that can target different gaps or challenges that are faced in a community? And as a consequence, right now the problems, if I had to look at it from the perspective of a system operator or a city engineer or city manager, is how do we leverage all of this, a lot of which is organic and others that are already there, but having very disparate characteristics. How do we get all of these together to come up with benefits for society at the highest level that we can realize them in? So that's the underlying objective of this. And I had mentioned two dimensions here, the technological and the social. So I'll start with the technological dimension. So I already mentioned that the ICSTs, which means information communication and sensor technologies, they have very disparate characteristics, and they come up organically wherever they come. And then there are advances that keep happening over time in these technologies. So they're not constant, they're in flux already. And on top of that, because of this, the decision makers in many ways are overwhelmed, because the city manager says, okay, what should I do with this? How do I use or leverage these technologies in a rather deliberate manner, or even systematic, from a systematic perspective? And so many of these existing connected and smart technologies are not being adequately leveraged. So that's one. But then if you look at some of the emerging technologies and modes that I just talked about, for them, it's even more challenging, because they're not yet in the deployment mode in most cases. And those technologies are still not mature as well. So the level at which we can leverage them or use them to enable quality of life in communities is something which is an open question as well. So that's one side. The other side is the social dimension, which is that in a community, we have a lot of heterogeneity. Just as a simple set of factors, age, gender, income, employment, all of these vary. So there is already heterogeneity in the community. So that immediately raises the point that potentially solutions are not one fits all. So what that means is that when we come up with solutions, that these solutions, ideally, we want to be having some level of intelligence, so that they're targeting different groups. And in that manner, we are able to reach, hopefully, most of the community, if not all of it. And the challenge is, in addition to that, there are different stakeholder levels. I'll actually talk about that in the next couple of slides. In addition to the residents, you also have providers, whether it's related to transportation or other aspects. We also have what I call influencers, those who can provide impact at a much broader level. And then you have also the governance, which is where the decisions are made. So what this does is it makes it difficult to kind of connect this to intelligent technologies into some solutions where the society is benefiting in potentially the best way possible. And that's one. The other thing is, even if some solutions are being proposed, these solutions may not illustrate inequities as well, because there are different groups, and some groups, even if you're not intending it to, may be excluded. And part of the issue is, how do we become aware of that, and how do we, in a targeted manner, address these questions? So the challenges, again, I go to the point that we want to have societal benefits at the highest potential there, is how do we leverage the organic emergence of these new modes and technologies and the various ICSTs and community in terms of the heterogeneity, both at the level of the residents as well as in terms of the stakeholder levels. How do we engage them to come up with sustainable travel at the community level? And in this context, there are 4 primary challenges that I would like to illustrate. And I'll be referring to some of this as challenge 1, challenge 2, 3, and 4. The first one is what I had already mentioned, that there are disparate characteristics for the data. But how do we translate that into information that's useful? That's the first one. The second one is, how do we then target different stakeholder groups in a rather deliberate manner? The third one is, how do we systematically keep track of the progress at the community level in terms of sustainability? And the last one is, there is emergence of multiple modes, many of which are in the private sector. When you talk about the Ubers, Lyfts, or the micromobility, the spins, all the scooter companies and so on, they are showing up where they want to, when they want to. Of course, there are some rules and regulations that need to be followed, but beyond that, they're showing up when and wherever they are. And the question is, how can we leverage the public sector and private sector? And the public sector here is that, at least the transit systems, they're operated in the public sector. How do we try to benefit from that? So in that context, we look at sustainable travel here in the context of 4 objectives. The first one is we want to enhance mobility. Second is safety. Third is access to transportation. The fourth is equity for the users of the system. And we want to address these. And the main objective here is, can we come up with the systematic framework? And that there are multiple types of methods that we leverage here to come up with hopefully some new models and methods to address these problems. And the framework, in the end, whatever framework we come up with is something that cities or in the communities can use, and they should be able to operate independently. So they have to be holistic. They should be scalable. So they should be able to operate from a computing standpoint as well, in addition to the other dimensions that I mentioned. And they should be transferable. So whatever we come up with shouldn't be tied down to one particular community, should be able to operate in multiple contexts. So, and this was the basis for a Smart and Connected Communities project. It's an NSF project. My co-PI, Omar Asancio from the School of Public Policy at Georgia Tech. It's a 4-year, $2.5 million project, started about a year and a half, slightly more than a year and a half ago. And the objective there is what I had so far expanded on in terms of coming up with solutions. And we call this multidimensional because there is the social dimension, there is the technological dimension. But even within that, we want to address these objectives at the community level, within stakeholder groups and across stakeholder groups. And our community partner here is the City of Peachtree Corners. I'll call that PTC from here on, which is, I'll explain that in the next slide, some details there. And other partners which are associated with that community as well are an innovation and technology ecosystem called Curiosity Lab. It's a very actually open and progressive ecosystem, because the city seeks to attract anyone to use their facilities for free. So it's something where they're saying, come and explore. You can come and use us. So there are companies that come, there are companies that go. And I'll mention some of that as we go along here. And then we have the transit system, which is called Gwinnett County Transit. We also interface with a high school. And Georgia has a partnership for innovative inclusion. And that seeks to provide access to solutions for different communities, whether they're poor, rich, whatever it is, in a way that everyone can access the solutions. So this is a organization that enables that in Georgia. So the community itself, if you look at Atlanta, the city of Atlanta, for those of you who are familiar with it, you'll see that there is what we call the perimeter, and you have inside the perimeter and outside of it. And there are suburbs here. So you see Peachtree Corners here is a northeastern suburb. And of course, the other point is it's the largest city in Gwinnett County. That's why it's Gwinnett County Transit. Actually, that county itself has close to 1 million people, the population of the county. It's still the second largest one. The largest one includes Atlanta and the suburbs and some other areas, which is slightly more than 1 million people. And the population of PTC is about 42,000. And it's the only one which has been developed as a planned community somewhere around 2010. So it was a very deliberately planned and organized community. And I guess the focus of this was, we want a community that also is able to leverage advances that are showing up, and can we provide our community as a living lab? So if you look at it, so there are a lot of aspects there that actually fell into place in this context. About half the population is female, the other half is male. And age group, we have a majority of them in the age group from 18 to 64. The median household income is about 65,000. And the racial makeup is about half is white, and African American about a quarter, and 10% Asian, and the rest is the rest of the other groups in the population. So in terms of the community stakeholders, this is something that I'd mentioned. We classify them into 4 groups here: users, who are the residents, the employees in the community, and the visitors, because all of them have an impact on transportation or travel in that area. Then we have the influencers. These are the big entities such as schools, big employers, or non-governmental organizations, foundations, so on, which and you can look at this even as places of worship, which can be reached at large scale levels, so that you can impact multiple people at the same time. And then you can have providers as well. And as I mentioned, there are 2 types here. One is our transit, but then the emerging mobility solutions as well. And when I talk also about information, because there are different ways we bring in information, and I'll mention that later as well. So information service providers, mobility providers. and the governance is in terms of the city. And there are a bunch of technologies that are either advanced or emerging that are present here. What you see here at the center figure here is a AV shuttle lane. And you can see these barriers. These are not permanent barriers, but these are separating off the this lane from the next one where any regular vehicle can go. In the process, what they did is they actually reduced the width of the lane. So some people were complaining about that. But what it does is during the, and this is completely open. It's not a controlled facility or any of that, except for the fact that right now, this shuttle travels around 13 miles per hour or so. So they'll progressively scale it to maybe 30 miles, but right now that's what it is. And you also have a lot of communications advancements put into place as well. T-Mobile does that with the 5G wireless environment. There are a lot of ancillary companies that also work, because here you need to get the data, store the data, and then use the cloud to transfer it as quickly as possible. That's part of it. And then you have electric vehicle charging stations. We also have interactive displays that actually ties to these information solutions that we are talking about, where there's very huge information displays that are mobile. You can place it at different parts of the community. Really huge displays that you can move around. And currently, we engage the community, and we have been doing it through community events where they have, say, fall festival or summer festivals and so on. And then there is also a community app through which we provide information, we gather data through surveys, and the interactive displays that we put in place as well. And in terms of the modes that are currently there, you have private vehicles that's there. But what we are talking about is the ones which are service providers. So Gwinnett County Transit provides 2 routes. I'll illustrate that in the next slide. And in addition to that, what you'll see is the AV shuttle. It runs on a 3-mile test track. That's the one. This is the one that I'm talking about. So this extends for 3 miles. And previously, in terms of micromobility, there was a vendor called Tortoise. And right now, they're in exploration for new vendors. And this is what I was talking about earlier. Vendors come and go, but the city is trying to figure out what would be the best plan out there. So for example, initially when Tortoise was there, we were looking at how we could get these scooters placed at the right locations in the city so people can actually use that, travel to a bus route, and then take a bus. So what that would mean is overnight, these vehicles are autonomously moved remotely by people to locations where there's higher demand. So that is one aspect. And so in the next slide, I'm going to expand on this. So I'll hold off on this. In terms of the vehicle availability, as you can see, there are 2 or more vehicles. Most of about 70% have 2 or more vehicles. So there's a lot of availability of vehicles, but then there is a population which also small population, very small population where no vehicles are available. So, and then in terms of mode of transportation, because this data came from the census data, we just looked at it in terms of the transportation to work. But in our solutions, we are also looking at non-work related trips as well. And as you can see, a majority of the trips are using their individual vehicle. And of course, that's the reason why there is congestion in this area as well. And we are engaging with the community in multiple ways. So I talked about workshops. We have an app that we created. This is an iOS app and a Android app. So it's something that people can use their smartphones to conduct surveys, also to get real-time data on the decisions that people take. We have providers, and as I mentioned here, the Gwinnett County Transit is the transit route. And an intriguing question here is, can we connect that with other vendors, in this case, the AV shuttle, but also the micromobility, to come up with partnerships that allow people to increase their usage of transit. And what that means is, if people are outside a certain radius of where the transit route is, they may say, well, it's not an option for me because I have to walk a long distance. So the question is, can we use some of this micromobility or other services to do that, what we call last mile, first mile type issues, and then connect to the transit route? And if we can do that, would a small percentage or some percentage of the user shift to this option? And if they do, that in itself can increase the quality of life in the area because you reduce congestion at the minimum. So, and in terms of the governance side with the city, we collect data that they already own or operate. And then we also want to provide information or solutions that they can consider and see if they can use those as part of their policy decisions. And also to deliver information, because the interactive displays are owned by the city. And the Wi-Fi and so on, again, the city provides that. So the point is, can we leverage some of this? And I already talked about the influencers. I also talked about Curiosity Lab. So in the interest of time, I'm going to get a little faster here, because with Curiosity Lab, there are a lot of companies, many companies. There's a company that's looking at underground transportation of goods. So they actually have pipes in which they are hoping to send out goods. And there are a bunch of them here. Just in this context, if you look at Navia and Oli, they're autonomous shuttle providers. So they're actually manufacturers. Then Beep is a company that manages and then stores all of that data. And OVH Cloud provides solutions in the cloud so that the data can be collected and then transmitted using the 5G that T-Mobile provides in very fast time. So there are a lot of these that seem to connect together to come up with solutions here. So this is the framework that we propose in this context. And this is, if you have to look at where we are looking at our contribution, this would be it. So we start with the various community stakeholders. And so we get information from them through different engagement mechanisms. But we also have data through the smart sensors and other data collection technologies. So through outreach to the community and to using the sensors that are there, we've come up with an integrated information system where we have all these various sources of data. I'll show it in the next slide. And how do you collect the data and how do we integrate it so that it makes sense? So that's the key point here. And when we do that, we'll have the current multidimensional state in multiple dimensions, the state of the community that we are interested in, because the goal that we have is sustainable travel, which is a broad goal, but we have specific objectives as part of that. Once we have that, the next one is to assess the current state in terms of whether it's meeting the mobility, safety, access, and equity-related objectives that we have. And what we want then is, if it is not, we want to have some kind of optimization so that we can come up with a solution which would be ideal for a community, for that community, based on their objectives and so on. So that's what we call the desired multidimensional solution, which is nothing but an aspirational one. That's what they're aspiring to. The problem is you won't get there just by looking at this, because this is not the real world. The real world comes when you bring in the humans and the other providers and the stakeholders in the community, because in the end, what they do is going to shape the solution that we obtain. So that's why we have a virtual community simulation for stakeholder consistency. And this is very important, because at the end of this, whatever solution we have is something we then want to use some solution options to get to. So the point being here that at this level, we consider the behavior and attitude of the residents and others in the community, the providers in terms of what constraints they have, because they are the ones providing the resources. And the solutions that we get here are then, we want to try to reach this. So ideally, we want to get to this point, but that's why we use different types of options here. Some which are at the individual level, where what we call behavioral interventions. I'll explain that in a little bit. Policy interventions, which is where the city can provide some kind of solutions as well. And emerging mobility solutions, for example, partnerships involving the private sector and public sector in this case, as an example. And these are solutions that we want to design. And then we deliver these in multiple ways, using the app that we created through the interactive displays that I mentioned earlier. Community has a website of its own through workshops and meetings. We have regular workshops and meetings. And the point that we are trying to emphasize here is that even they should be able to do this when we are out. Otherwise, it's not a sustainable solution for them, framework for them. So the nice thing is the community does have this nice space. I mentioned the Curiosity Lab, where they have regular meetings and where the community can meet up and have interaction. So there are workshops and meetings they had even before we were doing this for the community. And the high-level plans and guidelines that we can provide to the city as well as to the providers in terms of why or what they can do to enable the sustainability goals of the community, in this case, PTC. So the details of the framework, we start with the data that's coming from the community level stakeholders and the sensors and others. These go to the app, and we come up with the integrated information system. And I talked about challenge 1, 2, 3, and 4. Here, how do we integrate data and then convert it to some actionable information? That was what was challenge 1. And then once we do that, we assess the current state and come up with an aspirational solution. And then we do the virtual community simulation, where we try to understand the behavior and attitudes of the residents and others in the community, as well as the providers and other stakeholders as well, including what the city is willing to do or not do. So, and these address the remaining 3 challenges that I mentioned there. And this is where we have the 3 types of solutions. We come up with the targeted information. These are displayed through the Transact app, through the interactive displays. That's when we do it in real time. But we can also do it through educational seminars, educational workshops, because sometimes providing that information as educational helps a lot for members of community who are otherwise unaware that there are options that they can actually leverage. So that's another point here. And the first one there is the integrated information system, where we translate this multi-timescale, multi-source data into actionable information. So the next slide, I'll have a table that shows what type of data we have in the context of PTC, and what is the current state of the community in relation to the sustainable travel objectives we have. And then can we come up with measures that are quantifiable? Because in the end, when a city says, okay, I want to use this, I like this framework, they should be able to have some measures that they can track on a regular basis. I mean, that's part of the challenge they face, and that's why they're overwhelmed, because they see all this organically showing up, and the question is, how do you integrate and make sense of it? So we visualize all of this on a dynamic data visualization platform. So I'll start with this one, the multi-timescale. I had mentioned this. In terms of the data we collect, if you see it, the data, the variability is in terms of the time scale. It's in terms of the source of the data. It's in terms of the geographical scale of the data, because you'll see here, for example, the first box here, it says socio-demographic and accident data. This is discrete. It happens, you collect it. And they're either at the census level or at the level of a road link, for example. Then you have autonomous vehicle data that BEEP collects, and it's collected on a daily basis, and it's collected at shuttle stops. So then they have the traffic count, transit data, which is hourly. And again, here you see it's either on the roads or at bus stops. And then real-time data in terms of weather, because weather affects transportation as well. And the travel speed data. And this is a company called Here that is able to provide that. So there's data that is very diverse here, both in terms of time scale, in terms of geography, in terms of whom we have to get the data from. So all of that needs to be obtained and integrated. And you'll see that the data that we have for some of these have different ranges in terms of the years themselves. And that's the challenge that any real community will face. And the question is, what we want to do is to provide a platform with whatever data they have, they can integrate and make sense of it. And that's what we do first. We first mine and clean the data, then fuse or integrate the data, and then we use clustering algorithms. And this is used primarily in this case to identify locations which are more accident prone. So that's the objective of this. And from that, we create this dynamic data visualization platform. This looks something like this, where we can have multiple layers. And we actually, initially, the question that we had was, there are GIS software, why not use them? The problem that we face is that we want tools or mechanisms which are highly customizable. We can interactively visualize them. and they're efficient for real-time visualization of data. And so we use some of these tools to come up with a platform that we built, which is a Python-based visualization platform. It comes up with different layers here, and these layers can be combined, which means if you're asking a specific question, for example, how well is the transit route or set of transit routes in this community connecting or providing access to the residents of this community? So that would be one. So we have the transit layer, then we'll have a layer for the population. We can have a layer for the income levels and see how much access is provided and where the challenges are for people. So the capability is, I already mentioned this, real-time visualization, so we can capture these interactions that happen in both space and time. And in the next slide, I'll expand on this, because this is where we look for a particular solution for PTC in this case. So what are some of the things that can be done with this? We can address, the city can address problems that are emerging, that's first. Address equity-related issues, identify them, identify if there are some population groups that are vulnerable. So, and we actually consider two of them. The first one is those who are lower income and potentially do not have access to smartphones. I mean, that's why we are talking about interactive displays. But we are also talking about senior residents, because in many cases, based on when technology showed up and so on, seniors can be overwhelmed with the use of technology. So if they're not as savvy, then they may just completely exclude those as options for themselves, because they're just intimidated or feel like, oh, this is too much for me. And so these are the two groups that we were looking at in the context of our study here. But there may be other groups, and that depends on the community of interest. So this is the case study for the community here. And the test track here will be, you'll see the AV shuttle stop. So there is a test track here, which is about 3 miles here. And this is the city, Peachtree Corners. And what you see in different colors here, the light ones show lower income, and the darker ones show higher income group. So where, the neighborhoods. And so what you also see are the transit stops here. There's one that goes just at the extreme edge of one edge of the city, and that is Route 10A, 10B. But there's one that actually goes through the city itself for some distance. And the question that PTC wanted, actually, it's in the process of determining, they want to extend this route here. And they may either use the existing road network, but they're also talking about when they want to extend it, they may do it exclusively on AV lane that is created. So they actually will build. So they were looking at both of these options. And so the question they had was, what is it that they want to do, they should be doing? Their preliminary option was, okay, we'll just do it here. So without looking at anything else, this is what they wanted to do. And the reason they wanted to do here is this is where the city's mall was, the Forum Malls, actually, it's called in Atlanta. So they're out here. So they felt that maybe that's a big attractor. We should have it extend all the way here. But then if you look at the other aspects, and that's what we do in this study, is we also look at where people live and where there are transportation deserts, if you want to call it that. So if you look at the blue oval here, that's where 45% of the population lives. Most of the apartment complexes, which are shown as green dots here, they're out there. There are grocery stores shown in orange or mustard out here. So this is what we have here. There are a couple here, there are a couple here, and there are a few there. And the route that is available, actually, this is where a lot of the problem is, because many of these people don't have good connections to get to the grocery stores, for example. And that is something people should be able to do. And if you look at the red oval, which is the higher income neighborhood, about 35% of the population, this is largely disconnected from existing transportation solutions, because they just use their vehicles to move. And so the key point is, well, they can afford it. That's a good one. But the question, and that's what is the intriguing question, if we provided transit options in those areas, would it get some of them to shift? Maybe they are looking for sustainable options themselves. They don't want to drive their vehicles. So if so, what would be a good way to do that? That was the question that we wanted to address. So right now, what happens is, because of the number of private vehicles there's a lot of congestion in that area. Sorry. I don't know. All righty. And so what we wanted to suggest is the one that is flashing here, out here, in here, and one out here, which enables the routes to actually go through grocery stores in the areas where there's a lot of footfall, so that options are provided which are more convenient. So we wanted to see if the autonomous shuttle could be extended here in this direction, maybe somewhat in this direction as well, as an option for even higher income groups. So it can enhance mobility and accessibility for the lower income ones, and especially provide access to grocery stores. In fact, the city manager was mentioning that this is one of the issues that they have. So by doing so, that would be possible. And for the ones with higher income, provides another option. Whether they use it or not, a small percentage uses it or not, that would be a possibility as well. So there are, if the city was just doing what it wanted to based on, they said, oh, the mall is there, we'll just extend it that way. That would be the solution. And if you want to look at it more holistically, having the data enables them to do that. So that's just to illustrate the point that I was making here. So once we do that, collect the data and assess the current sustainability state, then how do we come up with solutions that are desirable? That's the next step. And I already mentioned the 4 objectives here, and there are different measures that you can use for each of these. So some of these are very standard ones, system time or vehicle miles traveled for mobility, safety is crash, fatalities, crash severity, and then similarly access to different locations, and then equities in terms of different areas having different levels of performance. So we need quantifiable measures. So those are the measures. And the data that we obtain from the previous step, which is the dynamic visualization platform, we can then disaggregate it spatially. And there are multiple ways to do that. There's no need to optimize that, because right now it's already, we have zip codes, the sensor tracks, the block groups, and so on, which are available. And we want to be able to leverage that so that we can look at the current sustainability state in terms of the objectives that we mentioned here for the different community and zone levels, if you want to call it that. So the whole community, but also into smaller geographical or spatial disaggregation levels. So that allows us to identify where equity issues are there, but also computational tractability. When you talk about these solutions at the community scale, there is scalability even in computing that needs to be looked at. And then also to identify where we are missing out in terms of reaching members of community or groups in the community. And related to that, we want to come up with a spatial multi-objective optimization. Multi-objective means there are 4 objectives here related to mobility and so on. And coming up with a solution requires us to simultaneously optimize for mobility, safety, access, equity, and so on. And we have a bunch of mechanisms by which we can do that. So we come up with optimization models. There's a spatial multi-objective optimization. So we're in the process of doing that. And the idea is that when we do this, we get to a desired aspirational solution that we can try to reach by then factoring the social dimension, which is where the stakeholder heterogeneity is factored in. And this we do through the virtual community simulation. So at this level then, when we have the community level multidimensional solution, we can track sustainability objectives, because that's one of the aims of this study. We introduce various measures. There are some new measures that we introduce. We also explore public-private partnerships in terms of modes, but also come up with algorithms which are computationally efficient as well. And in the process, we can look at enhancing the quality of life for those who are more vulnerable, and also trying to seek lower crash rates and so on. So this is ongoing. So that's why this we are, as I told you, we are 1.5 years into the project. And what we're looking at is that if you use census tracts, which are slightly larger, if you look at it here, they're not providing us the ability to address equity issues. So we go down to the block level. So instead of 11 census tracts, we have 27 block levels. And then in this context, we are trying to come up with how we leverage both the emerging and existing modes like transit. And if you remember, I mentioned that the data that we're getting from the community by using surveys and so on, and the Transact app, we use that to build the demand and other parameters. And then we do the virtual community simulation, which is where we try to come up with a solution that potentially is realistic in terms of factoring the community constraints or attitudes, behaviors, and so on. And we look at solutions that are also scalable in terms of implementing them. So I already mentioned this, that there are attitudes and constraints we have to factor. So we use a multi-agent virtual community simulation so that we can consider different stakeholders, factor heterogeneity, and then come up with solutions here. And there are the behavioral strategies, the intervention strategies. We collect the behavior-related data, and we can come up with solutions that are efficient, which means computationally they're more efficient, and then they're effective in terms of meeting the objectives. So we are able to promote sustainable travel modes and travel behavior. So that's the objective. And so we simulate the real world characteristics in terms of behavior to come up with a solution that is consistent now with the context in the real world. And this is where we look at some aspects related to the intervention strategies. So there are different types. There's a whole new set of strategies that we are looking at, which are incentive-based rather than penalty-based. And these are tangible ones, which are monetary characteristics to them. So if you provide some monetary benefit, maybe some people will use that and say, OK, I'm going to try this out. There are others which are nudges, which are not blocking off or penalizing people, but providing some, in some cases, just providing more focus. For example, showing that if they use a particular route that they're currently using, they're expending more in terms of the emissions. Okay, so just showing that for some people, they may get to think, oh, maybe I should do another way of traveling, and maybe that will help. And this may not be for everyone, and that's the key point. And that's why the problem is rather challenging. We have to reach different groups at different levels here. And then we have messages, we have gamification where people compete against each other and so on. And then we also have targeted messages related to the environment, the emissions and so on, and the health side as well. And we test these using field tests, or we're at PTC. And this is what the Transact app does. And what we have as output for this is the behavior and attitudes, because we want to be able to simulate what people are likely to do in this community, what the providers are likely to do in terms of resources they have. So that's what we do out here. And this is just an illustration of the app that we had. And as I said, it's in both platforms. It collects data in real time, but also disseminates and collects information related to attitudes. And there are a lot of, I already talked about capabilities and contributions. And just a few final points here. The system that we talk about, the multi-agent system, if you recollect, I said we had work trips, but we also want to look at non-work trips, the non-commute related ones. So we have the activities, the virtual community. We use a real-world check by using the data that we collected in the integrated information system. Then we use it to generate the demand parameters. Then we can also look at the virtual community that is being created in terms of the simulation realism check. And this is just an example of what is being done in the simulation there. And finally, we do a consistency check in terms of how this measures with the aspirational solution that we're looking for. And then that gives us the solution that we want to provide solutions for. And I'll just skip this. In the case study right now, we have, for example, peak period and off-peak period, and off-peak, and then where are the locations of household and workplaces, different colors to illustrate them. So we have a lot of data going into that, and we can visualize that. And I already talked about solutions, behavioral nudge mechanisms, incentive mechanisms. The emerging mobility solutions, this is where we talk to the community the city, but also to the providers and to the public policy interventions. And there are multiple types of interventions that can be done here. Just one of them that I want to mention, and they'll go to the last slide, which is EV infrastructure. Because one of the things you can do, and I didn't mention it as part of the 4 objectives, when you talk about sustainability, emissions is another one. So my colleague from School of Public Policy is actually looking at these. That is, what are some of the challenges that are there? For example, there's a lack of chargers in multifamily apartments. So they have lack of access. If that's the case, they're not going to buy a EV. So those are the types of issues that are there. But in addition to them, how do we distribute them? For example, the city is requiring the following, and this is something that they feel is important for their sustainability objective. They're saying any new apartment complex or development that's taking place, where there are multiple apartments, they're requiring the builder to have these EV chargers, a few of them in place. What they do with it and how they actually allow people to access it, that part is not of interest. They want to make sure that there is the access first. And then the builder can decide what to do. So that's happening there right now. So the last slide that I wanted to just summarize what we are doing out here is that there are a lot of opportunity and challenges that communities have because of how these technologies, advanced technologies, and the newer emerging ones are falling into place. There are emerging mobility modes that are available. There are various types of data sources. There are multiple stakeholder groups that need to be looked at. And the question is, can we, in a systematic or from a systems perspective, factor the characteristics and the opportunities to enable sustainable travel in a community? So we're talking about scaling it to the level of a community. And in that context, we propose a systematic and holistic framework, which is scalable to the community level. But very importantly, as we mentioned, for example, even in Georgia, there are communities that are highly, highly disadvantaged. So more than 85% of the population is disadvantaged. Whatever we develop here as a framework should be applicable to either end. And that's the point that we want to emphasize. So we want transferability. And we also want it so that when we move out, the community should be able to operate it without having problems. Otherwise, it's not making an impact in the real world. We want to ensure equity and access are being systematically looked at and tracked, and that we want to leverage both existing technologies, emerging technologies, and the emerging modes of transportation. And with that, I'll end my presentation by acknowledging the team. In addition to Dr. Asencio, we have Kibriya, Rupa, Yufei, Chowji, and Ifan, students, all PhD students. There are also undergraduate interns that are involved in this and former postdocs as well. And if you have any questions or comments, I'll be happy to address.
Thank you. Thank you very much. We have a little bit of time for a couple of questions. I'm going to hand the microphone around. I'm going to start with one here while we get ready. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about how some of the things that you're working on, some of the things that you found sort of translate to other communities, particularly ones where, I mean, Peachtree Corners is very new and sort of very thought up in one go, but a lot of communities are sort of built over the course of over the course of hundreds of years or decades. And what sort of challenges you see in sort of translating some of the stuff that you're working on here into places that have infrastructure that varies in age and sort of have been thought of over much longer periods of time?
An excellent question, in fact. And that's why I mentioned just in the final comments that we want this framework to be transferable. So that's the first point. And so whatever we do has to be transferable irrespective of the characteristics of the community. But coming to this point here, as I said, PTC is more planned community. And they're also, in many ways, progressive in the sense that they're saying, bring us all the technologies that we can try so that we can improve our quality of life. Now, many communities will not have that luxury because they are, they come up organically and there's no planning as well in many of those. And many a time, because of the rapid urbanization, which is a trend that's continuing and going to continue further, you're going to see more and more of that. So we are going to see more constrained problems. What that means is we have an existing community and you want to expand. So there are two questions there. The first one is, when you're expanding, what can you do? So when you have an existing community, you're expanding on it, maybe you can do some of this in a planned way. Now, if you're looking at an existing community that's maxed out in terms of its ability to, the boundaries and so on, then the question comes in terms of what are the opportunities that are available and so on. For example, I can take Midtown Atlanta, which is where Georgia Tech is. So there are all these companies that are showing up, which are providing the micromobility services because they see an organic need for it. They see a demand that can be met. And so they're providing that. So in communities so there are parts of that community that are well connected in terms of MARTA bus routes, for example, and even the rail routes, that MARTA subway routes and so on. And there are other parts of the community which during the pandemic illustrated how dependent there are these people who need the bus service. And one of the things that showed out there is that many of the people who were most disadvantaged were the ones who needed to physically be at their workplace. They didn't have the bus service. They shut down all the bus service. This is what we mean by access being looked at more intelligently, equity being looked at more holistically as well. So that was one of the drivers. When I was writing this, I said this I wrote in early 2021, the proposal. This turned out to be something glaring because these things will show up in the real world when you have, granted that the pandemic is not something that's going to frequently happen, but what it illustrates is the inequity in the process, because when we look at transportation and services, it's not just about saying, oh, we provided a route through this neighborhood and we are done. It's about where people want to go to work, where they want to go to buy groceries, where they want to go to see the doctors. All of these matter. So even in existing communities that are constrained, there are other objectives that become particularly important that one can start looking at using this framework.
Professor Peeta, thank you for visiting and presenting. I really enjoyed. My question actually was partially asked by Rafael and partially addressed. So I ask another question.
Sure.
And the other one is, the question is more about the transit or mostly public resource allocation. I wonder, when you showed that picture of the bus route and the autonomous shuttle, the bus route is highly circuitous and it goes, around the neighborhood.
It does.
The goal may be to provide as much access as possible when the bus route was designed, but you know that there are options to realign the route, make it more direct, faster, more efficient, and more frequent, and allocate some of the saving to something like autonomous shuttle for last mile access. I wonder if you have any comments about this, or maybe a bigger picture of how public resources could be allocated to different modes, different
settings. So one of the things we are looking at, if you look at some of the solutions we are looking at, they're also in terms of whether we can reshape the current routes, because that would be easy for us in terms of coming up with solutions. The problem is not there. The problem is with the transit agency. They are very careful in terms of how they come up with routes, and they require a lot of justification to shift route, because I say, hey, my model shows very nicely this, you can do this and that. It requires a lot of shaping. So initially what we said is, let's work around this. Over time, as we gain confidence of the agency, that's one of the things. But it's not just that. When you say confident, not just us, the city has to work with them, but also these, the other emerging providers, if they can work with them, because that is one of the things we talked to the transit agency also about. We said these partnerships that can be developed, can have potential benefits for all around. Because in the end, when I look at a transit agency, and this is a well-known fact, transit in the US is highly subsidized because you won't be able to generate the revenue to meet the cost. So the question is, for transit agencies, how can they increase the ridership? So any way they can increase the ridership, they're going to look at that as a win for them. And this is where initially we said, okay, let's try to see what happens when we connect the people who are otherwise, far away from transit routes using these providers that are emerging organically, the new ones. But over time, it makes a lot of sense for transit agencies themselves to change the route. And you know why it will happen? Again, because of the systems perspective. When you change and provide, the supply changes, over a period of time, the demand pattern also changes. And that will naturally lead to the agency looking at it and saying, okay, maybe we don't have as much high demand here. We don't need to go as certificators. We can go a little more straight and so on. So.
Thank you very much. We have maybe time for one quick question. We're almost out of time.
How do you observe this sort of methodology of analyzing the system, the transportation system, kind of being expanded to encompass more communities like at the same time? So interconnecting the system within two jurisdictions or applying it to a kind of larger system like the general Georgia, Atlanta metro area?
And that's a good question as well. And it's a question of scale. But one of the things I found out when I was at Purdue, if you look at northern Indiana, just adjoining the Chicago area, we had many such smaller cities. And I remember when we were trying to get data for just traffic, signal data. So what are the current signal plans? We had to go to each of those cities and get that because the jurisdictions were different. So partly, the big challenge is jurisdictional. And then the question is, how do we integrate it across the jurisdictions? And I'll give another example in the Atlanta area. So in the Atlanta area, right now, what's happening is there are many counties which are surrounding the city of Atlanta from which there's a lot of traffic that's going into and out of during the day. So in the morning, they come in, the evening, they get out. And so naturally, there's a feeling that if you look, for those of you who have been to Atlanta, you'll know that traffic is horrendous. If you go near the Georgia Tech area, downtown, midtown, it's really, really bad. Two freeways merging together, all of that. So what they decided to do was, can we provide express service that uses HOV lanes to connect various counties using bus service? I actually use one of those. I live very close to this place, just further north of it. So I use that bus service when I go to work. And the point that I'm trying to make is they look at that service as seamless across 13 counties. So what I mean by that is there is one card, we call it the Breeze card. I have it here. So this is the card that I use, so it's called the Breeze card. So you can go from anywhere in Atlanta. You can use the MARTA rail system, the bus system, or you can use this bus system. That is called the express bus system. You can use it to go around. And that is a solution which is going across scale. So I'm just illustrating that as one of the options, but it requires political and jurisdictional buy-in. So what I'm going to say is you can find those solutions, but they're going to take more time and effort because you're talking about different communities, and different communities may have different goals because their characteristics also may be different, right? But as a framework, yes, you can go, instead of saying your community is PTC, I can go a little further to include Berkeley Lake and then Duluth, where I live, and so on. Actually, when I hit Duluth, normally Duluth, Minnesota shows up, but I live in Duluth, Georgia, by the way. So yeah, so it can include multiple communities like that, okay? And the same process can be applied, but the challenges, I would say, are not necessarily, they're more institutional, I would say. So.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. Let's thank our speaker again. We have a
Thank you.
small gift to you as a thank you for coming to visit us in Minnesota.
Thank you again, all, for having me, and thanks for coming to the seminar. Yeah.